Hello, learners. So let's continue our first chapter, the France Revolution. This is from class ninth book, India and the Contemporary World. The situation, the topic is France abolishes monarchy and becomes a republic. The situation in France continued to be tense during the following years. Now, before moving on, I should tell you what a republic is. A republic is a state in which supreme power is held by the people and their elected representatives, much like how a democracy is. And they have an elected or nominated president rather than a monarch. So it's not like the president or the elected representative is elected every 5 years or every 10 years, just like in democracy is. So a democracy is a form of republic, but not every republic is a democracy, right? Because in case of republic, the president could be selected by the people, but then he can stay president for life. He can remain president for life. That would also be a republic, since he is an elected representative and not a monarch. So this would make it a republic, but not a democracy. Why? Because in democracy, the elections are held after a period of time, and the elected representatives keep on changing or are likely to change at least. So, moving on. Although Louis XVI had signed the constitution, he entered into secret negotiations with the King of Prussia. So, Louis XVI had on the surface signed up with the constitution and accepted the demands of the assembly, but in the background, he was having secret meetings and negotiations with the King of Prussia. It was their neighboring state. So rulers of other neighboring countries, his other neighbors were also worried about the developments that were going on in France. Why? Because they were afraid that this would inspire their own people into revolting against the monarch. Right? Because whenever a single person is holding power, the situation becomes a little bit chaotic because he is not influenced by anyone, so he can just use his power relentlessly, right? So obviously he'll often use it for selfish means. No matter how moral the person is, he just can't stop himself from doing some immoral things, right? We just can't control our emotions completely. So that is in this case, since there is no bar on the power of the king or on the monarch, he can do any kind of immoral things. He can do anything that he wishes, and this would be bad for the people. Obviously the people would not like it. Suppose that the king wants to buy a huge fleet of ships for himself, or wants to get a huge palace built for himself, right? But there is not enough money in the treasury, so he will tell uh, his uh, his ministers to increase the taxes. And now who will feel the burden of paying a increased amount of taxes? Obviously the people. But the people are not having any benefit from the making of an immense palace, right? The people will not have any advantage of an immense palace. Only the king and his ministers alone will uh, have any use of the palace, right? But for the making of the palace, the people will have to pay all the all the money. The people would have to pay from their pockets, right? So that's why almost everyone was stirred up of their monarch. So they all had a kind of revolting feeling inside them. And now the kings, obviously the kings knew about this, and the kings were afraid that when a neighboring country people had successfully revolted, so it was inspire their own people that they can also revolt and overthrow the monarch. That this is not an impossible task; it can be done. So that's why they were anxious to suppress the revolts, or to remove the assembly from France and re-establish the monarch, or better to seize their land and occupy it. So the king of France was negotiating with the king of Prussia, was holding secret meetings with the king of Prussia. And rulers of other neighboring countries too were worried by the developments in France and made plans to send troops to put down the events that had been taking place there since the summer of 1789. So the other neighboring countries were actually forming plans that we will secretly send out our troops to France to help the monarch, or just to kill and suppress all the revolting subjects of France, so that people understand that those who revolt only have one end, and that is death. Before this could happen, however, the National Assembly voted in April 1792 to declare war against Prussia and Austria. So, Prussia and Austria were their biggest competitors and their neighboring countries. So, the Assembly decided that we will go to war against these two countries before they can do anything to us. Because obviously, the Assembly too knew something, too had an inkling about the plans of these neighboring countries. So thousands of volunteers thronged from the provinces to join the army. Thronged means formed large and densely packed crowd of people. Uh, from so they moved in large number of groups to join the army. To join the army for why? To fight against Prussia and Austria. They saw this as a war of the people against kings and aristocracies all over Europe. Aristocrats are rich and powerful or influential people. So the common people saw this, that this was not just a war of defending our country or winning some other land, occupying some other land. This was in fact a war for the liberty and peace of the people. This was a war against the kings and the rich and powerful or noble families all over Europe. So now they had a kind of mission in their mind that they wanted to liberate all of Europe from these ruthless monarchs and uh, and noble families. Among the patriotic songs they sang was the Marseillaise, composed by the poet Roger de Leslie. It was sung for the first time by volunteers from Marseille. So now I'm sure this is written as Marseillaise, but they speak it as or they pronounce it as Marseille. So less is kind of silent. As they marched into Paris and so got its name, the Marseillaise is now the national anthem of France. So this should be noted and underlined because this is a very important topic that you can learn right here. The Revolutionary Wars brought losses and economic difficulties to the people. Obviously, wherever there's wars, there's going to be huge expenditure, and France was already not a very well-off economy. So, these revolutionary wars means the wars to bring about a change. Obviously, every war is kind of revolutionary, but this was seemingly revolutionary even on the surface. So this brought huge losses and economic difficulties to the people. While the men were away fighting at the front, women were left to cope with the task of earning a living and looking after their families. Obviously, now when the men are fighting at the war, and I don't think that most of them were getting paid either because this was a kind of a revolutionary war. This was not a kind where they hired soldiers. It was like people volunteered to go to the war because they thought that this was a kind of noble task, a holy deed that they were performing. So all that the government could take care of was the rations and the basic necessities that they would require during that war time. But obviously, I don't think they were getting paid, and since they were getting paid and they were even away from their house for months and years, so but they all had a family, right? So the task of coping with all the difficulties that initially the man had to face and the task of even earning the living now fell upon the shoulders of the women. So the women had to earn, they had to go out and earn money, and they also had to perform all the household chores and then take care of the kids too. So you can probably imagine that the life of the women were just as difficult as was the life of the men fighting on the battlefield. uh, Task of earning a living and looking after the families. Large sections of the population were convinced that the revolution had to be carried further. So now large sections of the people. So most of the people were convinced. They were sure. They or you can say that they thought that this revolution it has to be carried further. So the revolution has not even ended even in France right now. Even in France, the revolution need to be carried on even further. Why? Because the Constitution of 1791 did limitize the powers of the monarch and gave but it gave political rights only to the richer sections of society. So you remember last time we just talked about how the people who paid tax is equal to 3 days of the earning. I think there was something like the 3 days of earning of a laborer or peasant were allowed to vote, right? And the people who pay taxes were active citizens and rest of them were passive citizens. So obviously the richer people were active citizens and the poor people were passive citizens, right? So this was not a win-win case for the poor people. The poor people were still suffering, right? They were not actually even considered citizens of their own nation. You can probably imagine how dishonorable of a thing this must be, like not being considered a citizen of the country that you have been living for so many years, that your parents, your grandparents lived and contributed to, right? So most people were definite about this, that yeah, we need to take this one step ahead. We need to give rights to the poor people as well. Not only the richer people have the rights to decide everything, we are a part of it, right? So political clubs became an important rallying point for people who wished to discuss government policies and plan their own forms of actions. So political clubs, like clubs where they organized political meetings or had political conversations, these became very important rallying point. They could gather support or muster people from here to carry out a task or to carry the revolution forward, in fact. The most successful of these clubs was that of the Jacobins. So the Jacobin was, I don't know whether it was a chain of clubs or it was a single club, but whatever, the name of the club was Jacobin Club. So this Jacobin Club was the most successful of all these clubs, and it got its name from the former convent of Saint Jacob in Paris. Convent is is a building that is that belongs to a community devoted to a religious life. So there was a kind of building in Saint Jacobs in Paris, right? And it was a convent. A convent, like I told, it was a religious building, and it had and therefore this club got its name Jacobin, because the building was in Saint Jacob. Women too, who had been active throughout this period, formed their own clubs. So women too were now forming their own clubs. Section 4, okay, this we will discuss about this in section 4 later on. So the members of the Jacobin club belonged mainly to the less prosperous sections of society, as is very evident, because they were now fighting for the rights of the poor people. So obviously the people who would fight for the rights of poor people would mostly be poor people, right? Rich people wouldn't like to get involved in a task that they don't benefit from. So suppose someone asked you to work for free, would you like to do that, right? If you don't have any if you don't find anything for yourself in it, would you like to do it? No, right? If you don't have any benefit from it, you won't do it. Similarly, the rich people didn't have any benefit to gain from this, only the poor people had. So obviously the poor people would be in it more. It's not like there weren't any rich people supporting them. Like in the previous revolution, this time too, like in the previous revolution, there were some nobles supporting the third estate, right? So in this revolution as well, there were some richer sections of people who thought that yeah, poor people should get a right to vote. Poor people should have more rights. So they were also supporting them, but in a very limited and small quantity. They included small shopkeepers, artisans such as shoemaker, pastry cooks, watchmakers, printers, as well as servants and daily wage workers. Their leader was Maximilian Robespierre. So this guy, Maximilian Robespierre, this ruthless and vicious and cruel guy, this was their leader. You will know why I'm saying that he was ruthless and cruel later on. A large group among the Jacobins decided to start wearing long striped trousers similar to those worn by dock workers. So they suddenly started, a large group among these Jacobins, the members of this Jacobin club, they decided will wear these long striped trousers similar to what their dock workers wore. Dock workers are workers who worked at ships and ports, and this was done, why was this done? This was done to set themselves apart from the fashionable sections of society. And obviously, who were the fashionable sections of society? The richer people, only they could afford fashion, right? The poor people couldn't afford fashion. Especially nobles who wore knee breeches. So nobles wore a kind of dress which was called knee breeches. So I guess it was because it came only to the knee. So it was also a way of proclaiming the end of power wielded by the wearers of knee breeches. So they decided to change their dress into long striped trousers. Why? To show that now the power is with the long striped trousers people. That is the now the power belongs to us, and the era of the knee breeches is gone. These Jacobins came to be known as the Sans-Culottes. So they became famous as Sans-Culottes. I don't know if you can see my book's binding. I don't think you can see, but Sans-Culottes, literally meaning those without knee breeches. So these Jacobins came to be known as Sans-Culottes, and Sans-Culottes means without knee breeches. Sans-Culottes men wore, in addition, the red cap that symbolized liberty. So the men of the Sans-Culottes group, they also wore red caps, and these red caps were actually a symbol of liberty. However, the women of these clubs were not allowed to wear them. So you can still see that even though they're talking about equality everywhere, they want rights for the poor people as well. Still, they are not including women into their schemes, into their grand plans. In the summer of 1792, the Jacobins planned an insurrection of a large number of Parisians who were angered by the short supply and high prices of bread. So, in the summer of 1792, the Jacobins, the members of the Jacobin club, they planned a violent uprising, a very violent uprising. Violent means you can already imagine now what violent means by here, like killing, looting people, beating them. It was not peaceful, you can say. So against the authority or the government of Paris. So these an insurrection of a large number of Parisians. So the Jacobin government, the Jacobins plan. So now these people of Paris were angered by the short supply and high prices of bread, as we had discussed in the previous video too. That now the bread, so because the population of France had risen and the crop production couldn't keep up with it, so there was a shortage of food and the price obviously rose even furthermore. So on the morning of August 10, they stormed into the palace of Tuilerius, massacred the king's guards, and held the king himself as hostage for several hours. So you can probably imagine how powerful they were now to actually capture the king himself and hold him hostage for several hours. Later, the assembly decided to imprison the royal family. So later, they imprisoned the royal family. Elections were again held because now, since the king is captured, obviously he can't rule the country. So elections are again held. From now on, all men of 21 years and above, regardless of wealth, got the right to vote. So it's not like they just formed a club and suddenly decided now let's go and thrash the king's guards and capture the king and overturn the complete country. They had to bind their time. Slowly over time they grew more and more powerful, gathered more followers, infiltrated the king's palace, killed the guards, and finally with deception, tricks, power, and all sorts of means, they finally managed to capture the king. And once the king is captured, the game is over, right? So now they could overthrow the country. So now they decided for elections, and now new rights were given to everyone, to all the citizens of France, all the citizens of Paris, at least, in I can say that everyone above the age of 21, no matter what their wealth is, no matter what their status is, they have a right to vote. This newly elected assembly was called the convention. On September 1792, it abolished the monarchy and declared France republic. So until now, the monarchy was still there. The king was captured, right? But the monarchy was not officially abolished. So now they officially abolished the monarchic form of government and declared France a republic, and declared that France is now a republic. France will no longer be a monarchic country, it will be a republic country now. As you know, a republic is a form of government where the people elect the government, including, like I told you previously, including the head of the government. So the people are the actual rulers in a kind of sense. There is no hereditary monarchy, so the position cannot be passed on to his son and then to his son, like in a hereditary manner. You can try and find out about some other countries that republics. Okay, so Louis XVI was sentenced to death by a court on the charge of treason. So obviously, like I told you, he was having secret negotiations with the king of Prussia. Maybe they proved it, or maybe they didn't. Who knows? But the thing is that they charged Louis XVI with treason. Treason means betrayal of one's country's government, or betrayals of one's country, right? So on 21 January 1793, he was executed publicly at the Place de la Concorde. So this was a place. I don't know whether this was a place or what if the place itself is included in the name. But he was executed on 21st January 1793, and soon thereafter his queen Marie Antoinette was also executed. So now starts the Reign of Terror. Now, after in 1793, the monarch, the king, was executed. Now, obviously, someone else had to take charge, and guess who did it? The leader of the Jacobins, Maximilien Robespierre. The period from 1793 to 94 is referred to as the Reign of Terror. Robespierre followed a policy of severe control and punishment. all those whom he saw as being enemies of the republic, ex-nobles and clergy, members of other political parties, even members of his own party who did not agree with his methods were arrested, imprisoned, and then tried by a revolutionary tribunal. Tribunal means it's a body established to settle certain types of disputes. So what happened here is that he became very dictatorial. He became the new Hitler, or maybe the old Hitler. I don't know if Hitler was before or after his time, but he became Hitlerish or Hitler-like, you can say. So what it is that he got everyone else killed or imprisoned, everyone who opposed him. So he's like, I'm the most powerful person in France. Everyone who opposes me goes to prison or gets his head cut. Boom. That's it. So if the court found them guilty, they were guillotine. Guillotine was a device which consists. I'm sure everyone has already seen a guillotine, but still, if you haven't, I guess you should. The guillotine is a device. It consists of two poles and a blade, which is tied at the top of the pole. I tell you, and a person's head is put through the. There's a hole at below the pole. So there's the poles actually joined together through a wooden plank, and in between the plank there's a hole through which a person's head is inserted, and then the blade at the top of the poles falls over the head of the person, and then the person is beheaded. Done. So it was named after Dr. Guillotine, who invented. Wow, what a great invention! Thank you very much, Dr. Guillotine. I guess you wrote in hell, and as you should. Robespierre's government issued laws placing a maximum ceiling on wages and prices. I don't know how they're saying that Dr. Guillotine invented it and it was named after him like it was a great invention. It was actually a very basic piece of machinery which was used for very cruel and violent means. So it's not like it was a great invention or anything. Robespierre's government issued laws placing a maximum ceiling on wages and prices. So he passed on laws that this could be the maximum wages and this would be the maximum prices of products. Meat and bread were rationed. Peasants were forced to transport their grain to the cities and sell it at prices fixed by the government. So he became very authoritative, dictatorial. He sort of tried to turn towards socialism, like how it was in Russia. So he tried to monopolize everyone around him. So he said that peasants now will have to transport their grain to the cities. Earlier, they would obviously sell it maybe around somewhere else, somewhere near them. Sorry, somewhere near them, or maybe sell them into the villages itself. Or if they wished, only if they wished, if and only if they wished, they would sell them in cities, right? But now they were forced to sell them to cities. So it's not like it's your wish whether you want to sell it to the cities or not. It's like you will have to do it or I will get you guillotined. Okay. So they were forced to sell them to the cities, and that too at prices fixed by the government. So it's not like you get a buyer who's paying you like let's imagine for argument's sake, imagine that someone is paying you 10,000 rupees for one for 10 for so for say 100 kilograms of grain. Someone is offering you 10,000 rupees, right? But the government is offering you 8,000 rupees for the same 100 kilograms of grain. So obviously you would like to sell that to sell them to the person who's offering you 10,000, right? But suppose there's a law that you, no matter how much the other person was offering, you will have to sell it to the government. So you're now at a loss of 2,000, right? You're now at a loss. If someone is paying you higher price, you are now at a loss, right? Or now it's up to the government, since you are forced to sell to the government, it's up to the government what kind of wages they fix. They will keep on fixing lower and lower wages, and since it's the rule that you cannot sell to anyone else, you will have to abide by the rules and sell it to the government, because obviously no matter how little amount of cash you are getting, no matter how little amount of money you are getting, you need it to support your family, right? You need it. No matter even if that 100 kg of grain, you will have to, even if you have to sell it at 3,000 or 4,000 contrary to the 10,000 that you would have, and you still need to sell it, right? Because you need money for the food, for your family, for your relatives. You need that money, right? So the government can even decrease the price to however much they want, and you would be forced to sell it still. So the use of more expensive white flour was forbidden. So people used to, I think they used to use this white flour in the making of bread. So now this was also forbidden. Equi- uh, all citizens were required to eat the pain d'égalité. So this pain d'égalité is a French word and it means in English equality bread. So they named their bread equality bread now, and everyone was forced to eat it. Nowadays we have a lot of different bread. So nowadays you go out in the market and then you see there are a lot of brands, maybe Britannia or Dairy or some kind of other products. I don't remember their names actually. So it's up to you, whichever brand you wish to buy. You can buy white bread, you can buy brown bread, or you can buy oat bread, any kind of bread that you want. But let's say that the government decides suddenly that you will be forced to, or you will have to buy only this kind of bread. You cannot buy any other kind of bread, you cannot eat any other kind of food, right? So what would happen? Suddenly you are forced to do some things that are against you. There's no choice to you given to you, right? It's like how they used to have slaves or used to perform forced labors. Now you are forced to do a certain kind of thing that you do not wish to do, and you are the ones who's paying taxes to the government, right? So the government should listen to you. The government should take care of your benefits and think about your choices instead of forcing their choices upon the citizens. But now the government passed a law that you have to eat the pain d'égalité, the equality bread, whatever it was. It was a loaf made of whole wheat. So maybe people used to eat breads made of different stuff before this, but now they were forced to eat bread made of whole wheat. Maybe this was a good decision, who cares? But definitely the people did not have the freedom, and this is one of the basic rights, right? This is one of the fundamental rights in any democracy, that there is a certain amount of freedom given to people. So the people did not have this basic amount of freedom. Maybe the government did this for the betterment of the people. Maybe it was right, but still the people have a right to decide. The people have a right to choose. Equality was also sought to be practiced through forms of speech and address. And now you must be thinking, now you might even be thinking that, so what's the big deal if they're forced to buy a certain kind of bread? It's not necessary that they need to buy bread. There are other lot of food products too. Why is it necessary to buy bread? But it's very similar to how we eat chapatis in India. Bread at that time was their staple diet, and maybe still is, but bread in France was their staple diet. Just like how chapatis are in North India, or how idli vadas are in South India, in the same way most of the people, as their main food course, used to eat bread. So let's say suddenly the government decides that you can only eat chapatis made of soya bean flour. So what would suddenly happen to you? Maybe people who don't like to eat soya bean flour, they would be forced to eat chapatis made of soya bean flour. They would be forced to do this. So equality was also sought to be practiced through forms of speech and address. So instead of the traditional monsieur means sir, and madame, you can say madame, which means madam. All French and women were henceforth, now they were now referred to as citoyen and citoyenne. So citizens, that is. So citoyen for males and citoyenne for females, I believe. Churches were shut down and their buildings converted into barracks or offices. So this was actually a very, very strong decision by Robespierre's government to actually shut down churches. But I guess people were not so powerful as they are in today's time. So imagine our government shutting down all the temples. You can probably imagine how big of a revolt it would cause throughout our country. Like no government would even think of closing down the temples, right? And this guy actually did it. He closed down all the churches and converted their buildings into barracks or offices. But still the people couldn't do anything about it, because this was a very ruthless and cruel, vicious guy. So people were basically scared of him. This is actually given in very brief. In this book, it's very briefly written. You probably don't even understand why this is called the Reign of Terror, right? Because there were several other instances in the history of the world that have taken place and which were more ruthless like this. So I recommend that you read about this on the internet or watch some YouTube video about it where they explain it in details. Therefore, you'll understand why what's the significance of this word, the Reign of Terror. Why was it called so? So Robespierre pursued his policies so relentlessly without stopping continuously that even his supporters began to demand moderation. So now even his best of his supporters turned against him and they wanted a change. Finally, he was convicted by a court in July 1794. So this thankfully didn't last long, only 1 year. So he was arrested by a court, or sorry, he was convicted by a court and given the warrant to arrest him. And on the very next day, he was sent to the very guillotine on which he sent so many other people. So he met the same fate what he did to others. I guess this is what karma is. What is liberty? Two conflicting views. The revolutionary journalist came, so you can read about it later. I don't have time to read these short notes. Moving on, a directory rules France. What is directory? It's a directory is a board in an organization. So you can say a member of or a group of people. So a group of people now rules France. How strange, right? First there was monarchy, then there came this assembly. The assembly who actually decided who just limitized the powers of the monarch and ruled along with the monarch. And now then this came there came this republic which was ruled through Maximilian Robespierre, and now a directory, a group of people are going to rule over France. So anyways, the fall of the Jacobin government allowed the wealthier middle classes to seize power. So after this Jacobin government fell down, now the wealthier classes came to seize power. A new constitution was introduced. So a new constitution was again introduced whenever a country, whenever a new form of government comes into power, they again goes on creating new forms of constitution. So once more, I guess it was for the third time maybe, a new constitution was introduced, which denied the vote to non-propertied sections of society as was expected, because now the wealthier people were again in power, so they started oppressing the poor people. So they again denied them any form of voting rights. It provided for two elected legislative council. So there were two legislative councils now whose members were elected. These then appointed a directory executive made up for. So now these elected members again elected some people and they appointed a directory. Now they created now they elected the members of a directory, and this directory consisted of 5 members. This was done as a safeguard against the concentration of power in a one-man executive as under the Jacobins. So now they were also ruling through a form of republic, but the power was concentrated in the hands of a group of people, not a single person. And why was this done? Because they had learned their lesson that if power is given to a single person, just like in monarchy, in the form of monarchy or in the form of the Jacobins government, it was done, then it could backlash against themselves. So the person can misuse his power. However, the directors often clashed with the legislative council. So now the legislative council was, you can say it was actually a two-level government. I'll explain you here. So first here, these are two legislative council, each consisting of, let's say, 10 members. This is only our supposition, okay? This is only for the sake of argument. We're not actually I'm not actually telling you how many members the legislation consisted of. So these 10 members, these two councils elected a group of 5 people here. Now this is the board of directors, so now this board of directors is obviously a higher authority than this legislative council, but it does not mean that uh, uh, it can overpower the legislative council and it can pass any decision on its own. Still, the legislative councils, they hold considerable power, and so the board of directors and the legislative council often clashed with each other, often had fights with each other. The directors often clashed with the legislative councils, who then sought to dismiss them. And now it's an interesting point. The interesting point here is that this legislative councils who had elected the directors also had the authority to dismiss them. So they could also remove them. This is the twist, a little bit of twist in here. So the directors often clashed with the legislature, who then sought to dismiss them. The political instability and the directory paved the way for the rise. So you can clearly see how politically unstable the country of France had become now. And this political instability gave rise to a military dictator. Obviously, the France still had a military, and military has a very considerable amount of power within it. So now this gave rise to a military dictator who was none other than the great Napoleon Bonaparte. Through all these changes in the form of government, the ideals of freedom, of equality before the land, of fraternity remained inspiring ideals that motivated political movements in France and the rest of Europe. Uh, what's this word? During the following century. So during the following century, everything was same. It wasn't like everybody wanted to seize power to bring about monarchy or a dictatorial form of government. Still, the guiding principles were the law of fraternity and equality, like these high noble principles. These were still the guiding principles of the people of France, no matter what form of government they had. So now we come to the women's revolution, I guess. Did women have a revolution? Yeah, the women definitely had a revolution, but it's not so well known. So now we're going to read about it. So talking about women, so women have all been suppressed in history. Not the same kind of bullshit that we hear nowadays about feminist ideas and all those kinds of suppression, but actual real suppression. Like women were never given a chance. If we look a little back in history, in time, it's not like the kind of situation women face nowadays. Uh, they were really being suppressed. Like in case they were not given equal wages, no right to vote, no right to leave the house and earn a living, right? Except in circumstances, in special circumstances like men going to war, where it was inevitable for them to go out and earn. They weren't even given the right to read. Maybe you have read it somewhere in printing. There was a chapter on printing in history. I don't remember if it's in class 9th or 10th, but there I read that women were not allowed to read books or novels or any kind of stories, but men were allowed to do all this, right? Besides that, women just had one job. They had to stay at home, take care of the family, and that's it. They had no freedom of their own, no rights of their own, and this was actual suppression of the womankind. From the very beginning, women were active participants in the events, which brought about so many important changes in French society. Yeah, but women were expected to be a part of the change, be a part of the revolution, be a part of the struggle when it came to it, right? They were not given any benefits, any advantages, but they were asked to sacrifice, they were asked to come up whenever their need arose, their need arose, right? They were expected to come up, but they were not expected to share in any benefit, share in any kind of advantage if it succeeded. So this was how women were actually suppressed during the early times. It's not like nowadays, like they just say that women don't have the same kind of respect as men, women are not respected. Nowadays it's just turned up into kind of mush. They hoped that their involvement would pressurize the revolutionary government to introduce measures to improve their lives. Most women of the Third Estate had to work for a living. Yeah, so obviously, women of poor families, or very poor families, in fact, I'd say not poor families even, of very poor families who couldn't sustain without two earning hands. In this case, in these special circumstances, women had to go out and earn, but they were only supposed to do such meager jobs like household ladies, or cleaning the floors, cleaning the windows, or making food for other people. Only these kinds of menial jobs. They were not given any opportunity to do something really big, like become a lawyer, become a businesswoman, become a doctor. They were not provided with such opportunities. And leave alone providing such opportunities, even such ideas were not entertained. If a woman had any idea about something like this, I guess they'll be just thrown out from the family or given a harsh beating. Most women, they worked as seamstresses or laundresses, sold flowers, fruits, and vegetables at the market, or were employed as domestic servants in the houses of prosperous people. Most women did not have access to education or job training. Only daughters of nobles or wealthier members of the third estate could study at a convent. And this studying at the convent, now you must be is thinking that I just told you that women were not allowed to read or stuff. So let me tell you that women were not allowed to read novels, short stories, and all these commercial productions. However, women of richer or wealthier families were sent to school, but not like women nowadays are sent like up to graduation or up to matriculation. They were sent only to gain some basic access to knowledge, only to learn how to read or write. Very, very basic or minimal information. Like they were sent to convents to up to, you can say, in our current standards, up to fourth or fifth class. That's all. After which their families arranged a marriage for them. Simple. So working women had also to care for their families, that is, cook, fetch water, queue up for bread, and look after the children. Now you can already see how tough the life of the women at that time must be, right? Nowadays, girls don't have to go out and stand in long queues just to bring some water back home. They don't have to fire up a lot of wood just to heat up that water for bathing, right? Nowadays we have gas. Nowadays we have home supply of water everywhere. So and that at that time women had to do all these tasks, and obviously they had to cook, right? And they had to cook by lighting up a fire every time. They didn't have gas at that time, or they didn't have induction cookers at that time. They all had to do this by themselves. They had to gather wood. They had to, yeah, obviously gathering wood was again then such a hard task. They had to go and gather wood, and then they had to make a fire from it, and then cook food with that fire, where there was not such an accurate flame control either. And if the food cooked wasn't very well, then they again had to receive harsh criticism. Their wages were lower than those of men. Nowadays, women have equal wages to men, but still they are saying, yeah, feminism, everywhere, whatever. But at that time, women really had much less wages than men. Suppose a man is given $1,000 for some work. For the same work, women would be given about 500 or $400, not even half the amount of the salary of men. In order to discuss and voice their interests, women started their own political clubs and newspapers. Obviously, very hidingly, it wasn't in the open, they did it. About 60 women's clubs came up in different French cities. The Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women was the most famous of them. So about 60 women clubs came into the light, and about of these 60, the Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women was the most famous. One of their main demands was that women enjoy the same political rights as men. Women were disappointed that the Constitution of 1791 reduced them to passive citizens. They demanded the right to vote, to be elected to the assembly. So you should remember that the Constitution of 1791 was the one formed by the assembly. Formed by, let me show you. Let me just show you. Where were we? Yeah, this is how. In the tennis court oath, it was formed by the tennis court oath by the Estates General. So the 1791 Constitution was formed by the Estates General, and it disregarded women as active citizens. Okay. So it reduced them to passive citizens. They demanded the right to vote, to be elected to the assembly, and to hold political office. Only then they felt would their interests be represented in the new government. So this time they decided that they had to take matters in their own hands. They had to take influential political offices, obviously by their own sheer talent and hard work. Like no one would give them it for free, but they demanded at least the opportunity to be able to hold such positions. In the early years, the revolutionary government did introduce laws that helped improve the lives of women. Together with the creation of state schools, schooling was made compulsory for all girls. Now, schooling was made compulsory for all girls, whether rich or poor. Their fathers could no longer force them into marriage against their will. This was against a very good decision by the government. Marriage was made into contract entered into freely and registered under civil law. Divorce was made legal and could be applied for by both women and men. Women could now train for jobs, could become artists or run small businesses. So these were the some of the changes that were brought by revolutionary government, which were very good and uh, very real changes. These were actually realistic changes. Women's struggle for equal political rights, however, continued. During the Reign of Terror, the new government issued laws ordering closure of women's clubs and banning their political activities. So during Robespierre's rule, they banned all those women clubs and banned all their political activities. Many prominent women were arrested and a number of executed. So now even women were arrested by Robespierre. Robespierre was so ruthless, he didn't even let women go. He arrested them and sent them to the guillotine. Women's movements for voting rights and equal wages continued through the next 200 years in many countries of the world. The fight for the vote was carried out through an international suffrage movement during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So you can clearly see for how long women had to struggle to finally gain some sort of political freedom. Just a very little, a very minimalistic sort of political freedom they gained even after struggling for 200 years. 200 years. It's a very long time. The example of the political activities of French women during the revolutionary years was kept alive as an inspiring memory. So basically, we can say that French females were the most active in this rights for women, in these revolutions for women. It was finally in 1946 that women in France won the right to vote. 1946, about the time when our country was got its independence. This was around when women got its right to vote in France. The life of a revolutionary woman, Olympe de Gorges. Olympe de Gorges was one of the most important of the politically active women in revolutionary France. So she was one of the most important women who were politically active. She protested against the constitution and the declaration of rights of men and citizens. So the declaration of rights of men and citizens. Here it is, the declaration of the right of man and citizens was brought out by the National Assembly, by the States General. So she revolted against this, she protested against this. Why? Because this excluded women from the basic rights that each human being was entitled to. So they didn't even consider women as being human beings because they were not given the same right as every other human being was given. So in 1791 she wrote a declaration of the rights of women and citizen, which she addressed to the Queen and to the members of the National Assembly. So she addressed this to the Queen and the members of the National Assembly too, demanding that they act upon it. So she demanded that they act upon this new rights of women and citizen. Olympe de Gouges criticized the Jacobin government. So now this was her huge mistake. She criticized the Jacobin government, the ruthless Jacobin Maximilien Robespierre's government, and for forcibly closing down the women's clubs. And as a result, she was tried by the National Convention. National Convention was, I guess, a kind of court, and this charged her with treason. Treason means betrayal of one's country's government. So she was charged with going against the government. Obviously, she would go against such an oppressive government, but still, she was charged with treason. And soon after this, she was executed. She was ruthlessly killed after this, and that too legally. So these are some of the basic rights in Olympe de Gouges' Declaration of Rights of Women and Citizens. You can read it if you wish. I won't be explaining these right here though. So this is something important. This is how you'll understand the mentality of the people of some of the people of France at least. In 1793, the Jacobin politician Chaumette sought to justify the closure of women's clubs on the following grounds. So he gave this explanation why the women's clubs were being closed down. Has nature entrusted domestic duties to men? Has she given us breasts to nurture babies? No. She said to man, be a man, hunting, agriculture, political duties, that is your kingdom. She said to woman, be a woman, the things of the household, the sweet duties of motherhood. That are those are your tasks. Shameless are those women who wish to become men. Have not duties been fairly distributed? So he's saying that nature itself gave this task to men and women, to men of hunting, of doing agriculture and political duties, and she gave these tasks to women of being a mother and doing the household work. He said that this is so because women has breasts, and breasts are the only source of nourishment for the babies, and since they have the means to nourish the babies, it means it is their duty to do so. And why is it their duty to do so? Because it was given to them by nature. This is not that something they chose, it was given to them by nature itself. So he associated the breasts or the ability of women to nourish babies with with being confined to household work and upbringing of the children. And furthermore, he said that those women are shameless who wants to take on the men's jobs or men's careers, and they should not do so. Now, the other main event or important topic is the abolition of slavery. This was a very important move. So, the abolition of slavery, one of the most revolutionary social reforms of the Jacobin regime, was the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. So slavery was abolished during the Jacobin regime, during the Reign of Terror, or during the rule of Maximilian Robespierre. And this was abolished only in the French colonies, which means the foreign countries, the foreign states that France has forcibly occupied. The colonies in the Caribbean, Guadeloupe, and San Domingo were important suppliers of commodities such as tobacco, indigo, sugar, and coffee. So these colonies, they had huge plantations of these necessary crops: tobacco, indigo, sugar, and coffee. But the reluctance of Europeans to go and work in distant and unfamiliar lands, meant a shortage of labor on the plantation. So, although these were very good and beneficial, rich resources, but the Europeans, they did not have any wish to go to distant lands and work there. Like right now, we Indians are crazy about going to foreign countries and working there, earning better income, right? But at that time, the Europeans were not so enthusiastic about going to different or distant lands, which were not even so familiar with the explorers themselves, let alone the common people, and they were not happy about working there. So it means that despite having such rich resources in these colonies, there was a shortage of manpower. So this was met by a triangular slave trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The slave trade began in the 17th century. French merchants sailed from the port of Bordeaux or Nantes to the African coast, where they bought slaves from local chieftains, branded and shackled. The slaves were packed tightly into ships. So they're saying that this a scarcity of manpower, this low manpower, this demand for manpower is met by a triangular slave trade between the Europe, Africa, and Americas. Now, so this is like it. So this here is, let's say, France, or France colonies, or right, and this here is Africa. This is Africa. So they here from the ports of Bordeaux, and what was the second name? Chateaux, I guess. What was it? Yeah, Nantes. So from the borders of Bordeaux and Nantes, the French people traveled here to Africa, and here there were some chieftains. Chieftains means the chiefs of the tribes. So they bought local African people from the chiefs of several tribes, right? And then they branded them. And branded, basically, what do we mean? I'll tell you what branding basically means. So they gave them their own brand. Uh, you can say, they had a symbol, a kind of their own symbol, made up through iron, and then branded over to the slaves by burning it hot. So like engraving, sort of engraving the symbol onto the flesh of those slaves. Like you have a symbol made, and then heat it up red hot, and then push it through the skin of the other person, and it will get branded into it. I guess you have the idea what branding means. You might have seen it in a lot of movies. So all I can say is that it was a highly painful, very very painful process, where they bought slaves, and then they shackled them, tied their feet and hands with shackles, and then tightly packed. And because they bought slaves in huge quantities, so there were obviously not much space given to the slaves on the ships, so they were all very tightly cramped and packed for a 3-month long journey across the Atlantic to the Caribbean islands. So they traveled through the Atlantic Ocean to the Caribbean islands. There they were sold to plantation owners. So now, so what this thing is that people, so buyers travel from France to Africa. From Africa they buy what do they buy? Sorry, they buy slaves. They buy local African people at a low price, and then they sell them at higher price to the people of Caribbean, to the plantation owners at Caribbean islands. Right, it's just like nowadays you buy something from somewhere and then sell it at a higher price, but in this case they were buying actual real living human beings. So they sold them to these plantation owners. The exploitation of slave labor made it possible to meet the growing demand in European markets for sugar, coffee, and indigo. And since they treated these black Africans very badly, they were not considered even humans, and they were sold at very low prices, so they could be bought in very huge quantities. And this huge quantity meant that the shortage of labor was met now. The shortage of labor was no more there. Now these slaves had to work hard without any pay, with very basic living conditions, and in fact not very basic, very very poor conditions. And many of the slaves even died during their term of work, and they had to work for life. It was not like a bound term of 1 year or 2 year or 3 years. They had to work for their entire lives until they grew old and died. They could have no family, no children. They could not enjoy their lives. They could not have money to buy something for themselves. All they just had to do from the time they were born to the day they died was just work and work and work, and that too for free. So the exploitation made it possible to meet the growing demand in European market. So in European people were demanding sugar, coffee, and indigo in more quantities. So it meant that more crops had to be grown of these particular, more cultivation had to be done of these particular crops, right? And this required more manpower. This meant that there needed to be more laborers. And how was this met? This was met by buying more slaves, right? So port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes owed their economic prosperity to the flourishing slave trade. And these border cities, these port cities, why were they so prosperous? Because many people traveled from here to Africa to buy slaves. So this slave trade actually gave economic rise to the port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes too. Throughout the 18th century, there was little criticism of slavery in France. So, throughout the 18th century, like 1700s, nobody actually criticized the slave trade. Everyone was happy with the slave trade as long as they were getting their coffee, indigo, and sugar. Nobody complained about what the slaves had to go through. Nobody gave a damn. So, the National Assembly held long debates about whether the rights of man should be extended to all French subjects, including those in the colonies. So now the National Assembly, it held debates like all politicians, all assemblies do, that whether we should extend our rights of man and human beings, like, because man, the slaves are also in man, right? So they decided whether we should stretch it on to all French subjects. Now since they're living in France or the French colonies, they are also in a way subjects of their nation, right? They are also subjects. Now whoever is living in India, unless he comes on a temporary visit to India from a foreign country, is a subject of India, right? And is subject to the laws and the rights of the Indian people also, right? But in this case the slaves were not given any rights. Only the local people, only the citizens were given and all the rights. The slaves were not even considered to be men, so they had no rights for themselves. It was But it did not pass any laws, fearing opposition from businessmen whose incomes depended on the slave trade. So just like how it is now. So they were afraid that the big businessmen would stop supporting the National Assembly, or they will come out in revolt, because the slave trade was very beneficial to them. So they would not like it, and the National Assembly didn't want to accept the didn't want to anger the big businessmen. But it did not pass any laws. Yeah, it was finally the convention. The convention means the Jacobin government, which in 1794 legislated to free all slaves or in the French overseas possession. So it finally passed an order that all the slaves in the French overseas possession, means all the slaves outside of the French nation, in all the other cities, all the other colonies, they were to be free now. This, however, turned out to be short-term measure, but this was a very short-term measure, because 10 years later, Napoleon Bonaparte reintroduced slavery. Plantation owners understood their freedom as including the right to enslave African Negroes in pursuit of their economic interest. So now the plantation owners knew that they could, to increase their economic benefit, they could do anything, even capture these Negroes, these black Africans, to forcibly work in their plantation owners. Since slavery was again made legal, so obviously they could do this, and nobody would give a damn to what they did. Right. Slavery was finally abolished in French colonies in 1848. So even till 1848, people were being sold around like livestock. Okay, moving on, the revolution in everyday life. Can politics change the clothes people wear, the language they speak, or the books they read? The years following 1789 in France saw many such changes in the lives of men, women, and children. The revolutionary government took it upon themselves to pass laws that would translate the ideals of liberty and equality into everyday practice. So now some forms of equality, like there are some forms of equality even in India, like no, you cannot call anyone untouchable. Okay, you cannot discriminate against people of any caste. So these laws are introduced into everyday life to bring about equality. But what if government starts saying that all the people of the country can wear only blue clothes, or only red clothes, or only clothes of this particular design, this particular fashion, or all of them must wear a cap whenever going outside? So this would be hindering the everyday life, the choices, the freedom of the people, right? This would not be bringing equality into everyday life. This would be hindering the everyday life of the people. It would be creating a nuisance, right? So but this is what the French governments did from time to time to show more, to bring out more equality. They actually use such useless measures. They actually brought out such absurd measures. One important law that came into effect soon after the storming of the Bastille in the summer of 1789 was the abolition of censorship. So this law, after the Bastille was destroyed in 1789, this law came into being, which was the abolition of censorship. In the old regime, all written material and cultural activities, books, newspaper, plays, could be published or performed only after they had been approved by the censors of the king. So just like nowadays, any material that is harmful, or that disturbs the peace and the unity of the society, is to be crossed down, is to be taken out from magazines, TVs, televisions, and any form of media, right? So in the same way, there was a board of censor during that time, during before 1789, which took out any such materials from the public view, from the public's eye. But this censor board was abolished. The censorship act was completely removed. So what happened now? The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed freedom of speech and expression to be natural right. So this Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen said that freedom of speech and expression is a natural right. But they did not limitize it. They gave it an open scope. They said that it is that every man is completely free, completely there's a complete freedom of speech and expression. There's no bar over it, right? So what happened is that newspapers, pamphlets, books, and printed pictures flooded the towns of France, from where they traveled rapidly into the countryside. They all described and discussed the events and changes taking place in France. Freedom of the press also meant that opposing views of events could be expressed. Each side sought to convince the other of its position through the medium of print. Plays, songs, and festive processions attracted a large number of people. So what they're saying is that they could now print anything that the writers wanted the readers to read. Like they could print their own ideas, they could print opposing views, views opposing the government, views opposing to a particular organization, to some powerful or influential person, because they had complete right of press and expression, right? Their complete freedom in press writing. So they could speak up their mind openly now, and they could try to convince other people too. This was one way they could grasp and identify with ideas such as liberty or justice that political philosophers wrote about at length in text which only a handful of educated people could read. So in this way, that the thoughts, the thinkings, the writings of great political philosophers could reach people far afar. So could reach to people in distant corners of the world. Okay, and in a very simple language, in a very day-to-day language. Conclusion. So this is the conclusion now. So this was the everyday life after the revolution. Now we're coming on to the conclusion. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of France. He set out to conquer neighboring European countries, dispossessing dynasties and creating kingdoms where he placed members of his family. So he removed all the early previous dynasties wherever he conquered and then put a member of his own family there to rule. Napoleon saw his role as a modernizer of Europe. So Napoleon saw himself as that he had to change Europe, he had to modernize Europe. He introduced many laws such as the protection of private property. So he introduced laws like private property was to be protected, nobody could snatch your private property and stuff like that. And a uniform system of weights and measures. So he also brought out a uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system. Initially, many saw Napoleon as a liberator. So many people initially saw Napoleon as a freedom fighter who fought for the freedom of everyday people, who fought for the freedom of European people from all the monarchs and all those ruthless kings and leaders. So initially, people saw him as that who would bring freedom for the people. But soon Napoleonic armies came to be viewed everywhere as an invading force. But soon this view of the people changed, and people started viewing the Napoleon armies as an invading force. Like he just wants to conquer everything, like Alexander. That he doesn't care about the people. He does not care about freeing people or giving them new ideals. All he cares about is conquering more and more lands and establishing his rule over them. Napoleonic, he was finally defeated. This is a very important point here. He was finally defeated at Waterloo in 1815. Many of his measures that carried the revolutionary ideas of liberty and modern laws to other parts of Europe had an impact on people long after Napoleon had left. So this is why Napoleon is called a great person, because he had very great ideas about revolution. He had very great revolutionary ideas about liberty and other modern laws that are used nowadays. So he had already thought about these laws at that time during in 1815, and even after he long died, people still took Napoleonic laws into consideration and worked upon them. The ideas of liberty and democratic rights were the most important legacy of the French Revolution. From the start to the end, the thing that the French people were basically on about what every government was about, what every government wanted to bring was democratic rights, was liberty, was equality. So these were the basic principles in which every government who overthrew the previous government worked upon. So they all had these same kind of ideals, but their approach was different. This is the basic difference between them. They all had the same ideas, but different approaches to it. So these spread from France to the rest of Europe during the 19th century, where feudal systems were abolished. So from France, this gradually spread into other parts of Europe too, because there was so many things happening over in France. So many events took place in France. So many governments turned hands. Colonized people reworked the ideas of freedom from bondage into their movement to create a sovereign nation state. So these colonized people, the people who were colonized, who were colonies of France, they reworked this idea of freedom from France, and they removed their bondage, and they wanted to also create a nation state, an independent nation state. Tipu Sultan and Ram Mohan Roy are two examples of individuals who responded to the ideas coming from revolutionary France. So other colonies too, colonies of Britain, colonies of other countries, France, Britain, or Austria, or such countries, they also saw these French ideas, these French revolutionary ideas, these French principles as something that they should apply in their own country, and that they should make their country independent, apply such principles to their own country to make it better, to take it even further than it was. And two important people from them were Tipu Sultan and Ram Mohan Roy, and Raja Ram Mohan Roy. So this concludes our chapter. I ask you to definitely try out the question answers. If there's any problem in any of the questions, you can definitely write it in comments, and I'll try to answer it as best as I can.